On this episode of Random Paint Jobs. Greetings all, Morgan here with High Tide Games. I recently finished painting my very first dragon. And it looks pretty good. Last year, I decided to get back into miniature painting after about a 15-year hiatus. I'd been hankering for the hobby for some time and finally decided on taking the plunge. As part of my return, I reached out to another LGS in the region to see if I could find some discount models I could start with. I ended up purchasing a rather large set of Reaper miniatures on clearance, of which Kyphrixis, the copper dragon, was one. Now, it had been a long time since I'd painted a large model. I had a Space Marine Predator when I was younger, as well as a Necron Monolith, though I never did end up painting the latter. When I sat down with the primed wings and paint on my palette, I was a little bit nervous. There's a lot of scales on a dragon and not many edges on wing membranes. By the time I finished painting the scales and the wing foredges, though, I was much more comfortable with the project and it just felt like I was painting another miniature. I had a clear Easter theme in mind well before I started painting. I wanted the entire piece in pastel colors with Kyphrixis holding onto an egg and a bunch of eggs scattered around the base. I googled different pastel color palettes and Easter egg paint jobs, eventually deciding on a purple-pink pairing for the primary scales. The base coat was done in Vallejo Somber Gray, which has a purpley tone to it, followed by Army Painter Oozing Purple with highlights of Vallejo Squid Pink brought up to an almost pure white. I added tiny, faint speckles and dashes of Vallejo Hexed Lichen, which is this nice, deep, rich purple color, just to add a bit of visual texture to all the desaturated colors I was going to be using. It also helps to sort of reinforce that egg quality of like speckled eggs, and I wanted that pattern to be incorporated into the scales themselves. My first attempt at the wing membranes went sideways basically immediately. The various turquoise shades I used were just too bold. I knew something was wrong with the base layer, but erroneously believed it would wash out fine with the highlights. What I should have done after painting those first scales was to put the model away for the evening and come back to it the following day with fresh eyes. Instead, I kept slogging away and just wasted a bunch of time. Eventually, I decided to repaint the membrane. I took the wife's advice and redid the membranes in pink, using the same colors as the scales but nixing the purples. I had concerns about the degree of coverage I'd get when repainting the blue membrane with a new white base, so I painted the second wing membrane with a blue tinted base instead of straight white. That way, there wouldn't be any undertone discrepancies. I also decided it was best to leave the underside of the wings until the whole model was glued together so I could approach the highlights correctly. The body was fairly straightforward to paint, time-consuming and requiring substantial hand dexterity at times, but uncomplicated overall. When it comes to classic dragon sculpts and simple paint schemes such as this, you're basically painting the same element over and over again, which is time-consuming and a bit tedious, but is ultimately fairly relaxing and enjoyable. You can just get into the rhythm of painting. As with the underside of the wings, I decided on holding off doing the final scale highlights until the very end. Not all the scales were purple and pink though, as I wanted an accent color that would draw the eye. Originally, I had intended on a more complex scheme where different colors were striated together on the same scale. As this was my first dragon, however, I opted to keep things fairly simple. I have a number of other dragons to paint, so there'll be plenty of plastic to experiment with once I get comfortable with the process. Instead, I picked out specific scales in a minty green, starting with a Vallejo heavy blue-gray for a base and highlighting with verdigris up to an almost white. The last major color introduction was for the claws and teeth. I again tried to introduce blue, but it just didn't work. I think if the color scheme had been flipped, with the primary scales in blue, accents in purple and pink would have looked pretty smart. The blues I was working with were simply too dominant for accents though. I rebased in white, then tried my hand at some peachy tones, beginning with a mixture of Vallejo Parasite Brown and Army Painter Ash Gray. followed by Vallejo cadmium skin into pale flesh. The result is a nice orange-tinted bony tone. For the green scales, I picked the middle tone I wanted and then went up with whites instead of a bright yellow-green, which is what I would normally use for green highlights. I did go yellow-green for the eyes, however, as I wanted to draw the viewer into the face with saturated irises. The face itself had no scales, so I reused the pink wing membrane scheme to brighten the focal point of the model. I took my time, glazing highlights instead of layering them to ensure a nice, clean execution. At this stage, with the head, wings, tail, and primary body more or less complete, I decided it was about time to glue the major components together and fill the gaps. For the gaps, I used liquid green stuff, a toothpick, and some brushes. I'd come back and paint the seams once the left arm was attached. Speaking of the left arm, it's time for some Easter eggs! To get a realistic grip without gaps between the hand and egg, I reformed the hand using a bit of hot water, which made the plastic pliable enough to reshape. It only took a few minutes, and at the end I was left with a pretty firm grip. Of course, it was only after the glue had set that I realized I had grabbed one of the only eggs that had a bunch of holes in the top. I opted for a bit of liquid green stuff to fill the holes rather than risk breaking off the claw by removing the egg and putting a new one in its place. After priming and painting the bulk of the arm, I decided to add and actually keep some blue. To build up volume, I made sure my brush strokes followed the latitudinal curves of the egg. I didn't try anything fancy, and again left final highlights until later. Next, I turned to the base. I used a massive 130mm base that I specially ordered specifically for the model, smooshing down the ruins into some green stuff and plastic glue so that it didn't rock about. I then slathered everything in Vallejo gray sand ground texture. This stuff is fantastic. I know it's little more than sand suspended in glues and other media, but I find the finish far nicer than just sand with white glue. The grain is finer, it's basically impossible for bits to come loose, and it paints easier, especially with washes. I find that washes and highly thin paints tend to loosen normal sand and glue, causing the grains to fall off. Not so with ground texture. I did add some strategically placed fine sand before the texture dried though, just to add some variation. I wanted to have some fun with the base, so I pulled out my little rotary tool, threw on a face shield, and cut off the top of an egg to make it look like our dragon took a big ol' bite out of it. The last thing to do was play around with egg locations. I put the half-eaten egg behind the model on the other side of where the money shot perspective was. That way you can only see it when you look at the whole thing. It's kind of like a little Easter egg. After spending so much time on finicky details like scales and teeth, painting the base was a joy. I went with gray stone that would be brought up with a bit of bluey green and standard brown dirt. Highlights were done with dry brushing, and I spent time getting brighter areas in the right locations. I don't have much experience dry brushing, so I thought now would be a good time to practice. I was also half watching, half listening to the inaugural episode of Kill Your Friends on YouTube, so I was keen on stretching out the painting session a bit. Dice gods be praised. Really? I hit all the stone with a mixture of Army Painter Strong Tone and Glaze Medium to provide some tinting that wouldn't pool in the crevices. You could use a very small amount of normal brown acrylic paint with Glaze Medium, but it's easier with a wash, which is already pretty thin. To add that last bit of oomph, I mixed some Vallejo Kmar green in with the strong tone and dabbed it into the crevices and other areas where water was likely to pool to provide a grungy, moldy feel. I hoped the high shine of the strong tone would show through whatever matte varnish I used to seal the model to keep that damp look. And it's back to the eggs. The eggs were fun. I opted for slightly more color saturation than the rest of the model to help make them pop. When it comes to highlights, I ended up with more of a striped pattern than on the held egg. I liked the stripes better. It paired well with the scale striations on the dragon and added some continuity between the dragon itself and the base. With all our basing bits colored in, it was time to fit everything together and take a look-see-loo. There were still about 3.5 hours of painting left to do. I had to paint all the seams, the underside of the wings, fix the egg, and do a bunch of highlight touch-ups. There was also the base to finish. I ended up adding a full coat of thinned grunge to the base to give a sense of moistness that matched the rock, in addition to some modeling flocks and tufts. The end result is pretty frickin' sweet. So I am pretty proud of the final result. I think the colors came off fairly well. My plan that I had for the pastel dragon, I think worked really well. The coloration is great. There are, of course, issues with it. One of the biggest things was simply the fact that I was learning techniques and changing my style during the process. The entire model took about 23 hours or so to paint. This includes basing, doesn't include airbrushing or assembly or anything like that. It's about 23 hours. And I noticed that there were sections that I had done right at the start, like the top of the wings, that have a different style to them than the rest of the scales. There's also the issue of the wings. The first wing I painted is different than the second wing that I painted. The patterns are a bit off. I used my dry brushing technique a little bit different. When it comes to the underside of the wings, I basically had to glaze it with a touch of white to just tone it down a bit because the backs of the wings didn't have as much pink in it. I could have taken more time and been more deliberate with the scale striations to add more definition to the lines. The model looks great from a few feet back, which is fantastic. Ultimately, that's what it's there for. It's not a display model in the sense that I'm putting in for a competition. So the scales look fine for what it is. But the next time I do a dragon, I will certainly be taking more time in higher contrast between each of the striations in the background. I was just going fairly quickly. The teeth and bones, but they're okay. That's not going to be my secret recipe for doing bones and claws in the future. The eyes came out okay. They are fine again for the model, but I want to take a bit more time next time. The base, I think, turned out fantastic. The stonework came out a lot better than I thought it was going to be, and the mossy, grungy wash that I used really helped to make the ground pop a bit. But overall, pretty good. I did like it. There is room for improvement, but it really does what I want it to do. I didn't do all the lighting highlights that I wanted to do, but again, that's my first big model in about 16 years, so I'm good with that. Now I do have 2 more dragons that I want to do this year, and I want them to be holiday themed again. The 2 holidays I have in mind are Halloween and Christmas. They are far enough away that I can take the time I need to paint them properly. If I start in the next 2-3 months, I'll have plenty of time to get everything finished. It also gives plenty of time for Kelsey to do the videos, because I want these videos to be in addition to the normal monthly videos that we have planned. I don't mind the once a month release for longer videos, but I think in the next 6 months or so, I want to start increasing that a little bit more. I do have plans for shorter, quick form videos that are only about 5 minutes long. We'll see if I can get to those. 23 hours to paint this Easter dragon. It was a lot of fun. I'll see you guys later. Visiting British Columbia? Stop by High Tide Games and say hello. We're only 4 hours and 2 ferry rides north of Vancouver.